Well, welcome everyone to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. My name is Carlo Broussard. I'm a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization Team of the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local radio station at a different time, since the Catholic Reason is now aired on Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside of the Tulsa area, welcome and thanks for joining me. You can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archive episodes at carlobroussard.com under the audio tab. You'll see The Catholic Reason there. And one last thing, if you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the air in a future episode, you can do so by emailing me at Carlo, K-A-R-L-O, at stmichaelradio.com. That's Carlo at stmichaelradio.com. We have a few questions coming in. I'm going to be putting them together, and hopefully in future episodes, immediate future episodes, perhaps even next week, I'll start answering some questions in the last of the 4 segments for our show. So let's get to the topic at hand for today's show. And that is why people don't care about religion. So why don't people care about religion? That's the question. There are several answers that people give to this question. But as we're going to see in today's episode, they all fail as rational justification to reject religion per se. That's our claim today, and I intend to make good on that claim. As I mentioned, there are several reasons why people reject religion. However, due to time constraints, we're going to look at 3 today. 3 particular reasons why people reject religion. And we're going to save the others for a future episode. We'll probably look at those next week. The 3 that we're going to look at today is number 1, most smart people are atheists. So I don't embrace religion because most smart people reject religion. That's the first reason. Second reason, religion is merely wish fulfillment to quell our fears. And then the third reason why people often reject religion is because people only appeal to religion because thinking is hard. The implication being that people just don't want to think for themselves because it's difficult, it's arduous, it's hard. And so that's why people just embrace religion and let other people tell them what to believe rather than thinking through it themselves. So these are the 3 reasons that we're going to look at in today's episode. So let's start with the objection that most smart people are atheists. The implication being that I should believe and adopt worldviews that smart people believe and adopt, right? Since, according to the evidence, so it's argued, most smart people reject religion or either atheists or agnostic, then it would be credible and rational for me to believe, to be atheist and or agnostic. And so that's the idea. Generally speaking, it's reasonable to believe or not believe something if most people smarter than me believe it or don't believe it, right? The intelligent people, so it's argued in our society that we know and respect, such as scientists and philosophers, they're often atheists. And the stat that's appealed to is, for example, 93% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most elite scientific organizations in the United States, deny God's existence. One study found that 73% of professional philosophers are atheists. So with such an overwhelming amount of smart people, both in the scientific community and the philosophical community, embracing atheism, if we want to be intellectually responsible and credible, well, then we ought to be disinclined to acknowledge that God exists and embrace religious beliefs. And so that's the general objection here. And I'm going to provide 3 answers to this objection. The first of which is this: just because someone is smart in one area of expertise, that doesn't make him or her, but let's just go with him for simplicity's sake, that doesn't make him competent when it comes to the question of God's existence. So, for example, consider this question: should we trust a car mechanic's view on politics because he is a good mechanic? Of course not, right? The training that a mechanic receives as a mechanic doesn't equip him with political knowledge or wisdom. Or consider this: should we trust a car mechanic's views on quantum mechanics? No, the training that he receives as a car mechanic doesn't give him the competency to make proper judgments concerning quantum mechanics. Now, he may be well read in quantum mechanics and be able to make proper judgments within that field, but it wouldn't be insofar as he is a car mechanic. The same principle applies to what natural scientists and even philosophers, generally speaking, who are not trained in the philosophy of religion, for example, say about God's existence. God is not subject to scientific inquiry. God is an immaterial being who transcends the boundaries of science's data source, namely physical reality. This being the case, no amount of scientific training is going to equip a scientist to pursue the philosophical inquiry of God's existence. So training in the methods of modern science is not going to equip someone to arrive at the conclusion that God exists. Just as we shouldn't trust a mechanic's views on politics or even quantum mechanics just because he knows cars, we shouldn't trust a scientist's view about God simply because he knows chemistry or physics or fill in the blank. Since the question of God's existence is beyond a scientist's expertise, as a matter of authority, his opinion on the matter is of equal value to that of any other educated non-scientist, just like his opinion on art or history or sports. The same line of reasoning is employed, or this same line of reasoning employed applies even to philosophers who are not trained in the philosophy of religion. And this is important because the objection, when posed, not only appeals to scientists in the National Academy of Sciences, but also philosophers in general. Remember, 73% of philosophers are atheists. Even if 3/4 of professional philosophers are atheists, that doesn't mean every one of those philosophers is competent and trained enough when it comes to the question of God's existence, any more than a biologist is competent in questions of astrophysics. You got a scientist and a scientist, right? But they're different branches. A philosopher can go through his whole entire career, whether in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of history, etc., and never seriously consider the arguments for God's existence as a philosopher of religion would. Even a philosopher, then, is not necessarily more competent to weigh in on God's existence than an educated non-philosopher. So, again, just because someone is a professional philosopher doesn't necessarily make him competent to weigh in on the God question, because his training may very well be restricted to a particular area of philosophy without any sort of serious consideration for the metaphysical arguments for God's existence. Many philosophers, accordingly, misunderstand the traditional arguments for God's existence and spend their time refuting only a straw man version of them. Consider, for example, atheist Daniel Dennett. He does this in his book, Breaking the Spell, in reference to an argument like our argument, like the theist argument for motion and the existence of things in the world, which would be two Thomistic arguments for God's existence, what he calls the cosmological argument. Here's what Daniel Dennett writes. The cosmological argument, which in its simplest form states that since everything must have a cause, The universe must have a cause, namely God. But then what caused God, he asks. Here, Dennett exposes his ignorance of the cosmological argument by thinking that its key premise is everything must have a cause. But the philosophical arguments in the intellectual tradition of classical theism, such as Aquinas' five ways, do not make that claim. That is not a premise of any of the arguments. Rather, the arguments start with the principle that whatever is in motion, say, must be caused by something else, or whatever doesn't have the sufficient reason for its existence within itself, whether because it comes into and goes out of existence or is limited in its existence, must be caused by something else, or whatever has ordered activity to a specific end or goal must be caused and directed in that activity. These are the starting points that the traditional arguments start with. These starting points allow for the possibility that something might be uncaused in its act of being a mover, causing existence or directing a thing's activity to an end or goal. When the classical arguments are worked out, we find that a series of caused causes can't regress infinitely due to logical necessity, requiring the existence of a first cause that is uncaused. And nowhere in that line of reasoning do we specify that everything must have a cause. And so Daniel Dennett simply misses the mark here, illustrating how competency in one area of philosophy doesn't give you competency in another area of philosophy, particularly the philosophy of religion. We've been looking at the question of why do people reject religion? Why don't they embrace it? One of the reasons that we began to consider was the idea that most smart people are atheists or agnostic. Most smart people reject religion, do not embrace religion. And since we need to follow what smart people believe or don't believe, it would seem reasonable that we shouldn't believe in God. We shouldn't embrace religious beliefs. Now, we offered one answer in response to that objection, and we completed it before the end of our first break, and that is just because someone is smart in one area of expertise, that doesn't make him competent when it comes to the question of God's existence. Whether we're talking about scientists within all branches of science, or even philosophers in other branches of philosophy outside the boundaries of the philosophy of religion. And we use the example of a car mechanic. His training as a car mechanic doesn't give him competency to make proper judgments and weigh in on political matters, right? Or his training doesn't give him competency to weigh in on quantum mechanics. And so just because somebody is competent in one area does not make him competent when it comes to the God question. Now, here's a second response. The stats concerning beliefs of scientists and philosophy actually favors theism. Now, keep in mind, friends, this doesn't prove that theism is true, but simply to show that if someone were to believe in God merely based on the testimony of others, it would indeed be rational and credible. Let's just say, for argument's sake, we follow this principle, which could be challenged, by the way. But let's just say, for argument's sake, we follow the principle that whatever smart people believe or don't believe, I'm going to follow them because I don't have the time or the leisure or the intellectual competency to weigh in on these matters and make judgments for myself. So I'm going to simply look and appeal to authoritative figures who are smarter than I am and follow them. There is rationality in that principle within limitations. So let's just say we follow that principle. Well, if we do, then we're going to have to believe in God because, as I said, the stats concerning beliefs of scientists and philosophers actually favors theism. So concerning the belief of scientists, the prior mentioned National Academy of Sciences statistic in our first break is misleading, precisely because that academy only represents a small and select number of scientists, with only about 2,000 members. For a better understanding of the community of scientists, check out the National Academy of Sciences article Membership at nasonline.org. According to the National Science Foundation / Division of Science Resources Statistics, in its article, quote, Table 2 Employed Scientists by Broad Industry Group of Employment and Detailed Occupation 2001, close quote. That's the name of the article. There are more than 2 million scientists employed in the United States. And so 2,000 members of the National Academy of Sciences, right? That only represents a small number of the broader community of scientists, which involves 2 million. Now, a better overview of the religious beliefs of scientists can be found in a 2009, with this in mind, that there are 2 million scientists employed, right, in the whole entire United States. Concerning their religious beliefs, you can check out a 2009 study by the Pew Research Center. The article is entitled Scientists and Belief, and it's authored by David Massey, M-A-S-C-I, at pewforum.org. And here's a summary of some of the stats, right? So again, we've expanded our boundaries, not just to the 2,000 members of the National Academy of Sciences, but to all scientists within the United States. 51% believe that God or some higher power exists. 41% of scientists reject the concepts of God or a higher power. And 17% of scientists actually identify themselves with the term atheists. So given these stats, the majority of scientists believe in God or a higher power. So if we're going to follow the principle of believing smart people, well then, even by looking to scientists in the United States, we would have to favor theism and adopt some form of religious belief. Likewise, the great majority of philosophers of religion are theists. So even if someone counters and says, well, listen, we shouldn't even follow the smart scientists, we shouldn't even follow scientists insofar as they say that God exists, because given our principle earlier, competency in one area doesn't give them competency in another area. So even if you have scientists saying, yeah, God exists, so what? There are scientists who say he doesn't exist. Now, with that said, if we go to the philosophers of religion, those who are indeed competent to weigh in on the God question, the great majority of those philosophers affirm God's existence, 72%, in fact, according to a Phil Papers survey. As atheist philosopher Quentin Smith remarks in his article, The Meta-Philosophy of Naturalism, in the journal Philo, and this is volume 4, number 2 in 2001. It's a journal of philosophy. Smith writes the following, quote, God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments. So if someone were willing to embrace a belief on the basis of what smart and competent people or smart and competent philosophers of religion think, well, then it would be more reasonable for that person to embrace theism, since the majority of philosophers of religion, those philosophers competent on the God question, are indeed theists. Now, whether someone decides to believe in God or not, at least he will know that he can't justify his atheism on the basis that most scientists and philosophers are atheists. And he need not fear that belief in God puts him in an anti-intellectual crowd. And I think that is the driving force behind this sort of objection. No one wants to be in an anti-intellectual crowd. So there's this misperception that to affirm God's existence and embrace religion and religious beliefs puts you in such a crowd. But these stats show that this is not the case. And so I think this is a good of these stats, although we probably shouldn't conclude and embrace the belief that God exists for these reasons. At least we can see that given the stats that a lot of smart people, and the majority thereof, embrace theism, we can quell that fear of being among an anti-intellectual crowd. We can at least see that we're in good company among intellectually sophisticated people and embracing theism and affirming the practice of religion and religious beliefs in general. All right, so that provides two answers of the three in response to this first objection. Remember, the objection that we're considering is, I reject religion because most smart people are atheists. Well, that's actually not true given the current stats that we just articulated. And furthermore, competency in one area doesn't make them competent in another. So those were our first two answers. Here's the third answer. Some of the greatest minds of history were and are believers in God or some transcendent power. So again, we're still operating on this idea. Listen, if we're going to follow this principle of looking to smart people and following their conclusions, or even on the minimal sense of just showing that to affirm God's existence, you do not have to be among an anti-intellectual crowd. Here are a few examples. I'm going to run through a list of some of the greatest minds within the scientific community that actually did and do currently affirm God's existence. So here's a quote from Nicholas Copernicus, right? The father of the heliocentric theory of the solar system. He wrote, "The universe has been wrought for us by a supremely good and orderly creator." Again, just because he is a scientist, just because he is competent in the area of making observations and judgments about the universe and the cosmos, doesn't make him quite competent on the God question, but nevertheless, he is a pretty smart dude, and he believed that there was a creator. And so that at least shows us, to affirm belief in a creator, you're among good company in the intellectual crowd. Johannes Kepler, German mathematician and astronomer known for Kepler's laws of planetary motion, had the following to say about God, quote, "Praise and glorify with me the wisdom and greatness of the Creator, which I have revealed in a deeper explication of the form of the universe, in an investigation of the causes, and in my detection of the deceptiveness of sight." Okay, so Johannes Kepler affirms a creator. Max Planck, 19th and 20th century originator of the quantum theory, said the following, quote, "Religion is the link that binds man to God." He got that right, because that's what the very word religion means. It connotes an order to God, that we're bound to God on account of God being our creator and our ultimate end. So continuing his quote, "Religion is the link that binds man to God, resulting from the respectful humility before a supernatural power to which all human life is subject and which controls our will and woe." So this is just a sampling of what great minds in the scientific community of the past said in reference to God. We could also appeal to the fact that modern scientists stand upon the shoulders of Catholic clergymen in particular. But before I do that, we're coming up on our next break. So I'm going to hit the pause button and save a listing of a few Catholic clergymen that were scientists that modern scientists stand on the shoulders of. We were looking at a third response to that sort of objection. The first two responses, one were, just because someone is competent in one area of expertise doesn't make him competent when it comes to the question of God's existence. Secondly, our second response is that the stats concerning beliefs of scientists and philosophers actually favor theism. The majority of both scientists and philosophers within the philosophy of religion favor theism, and so that could be a reason for rational belief in God and embracing religion. And then thirdly, before the last break, I was beginning to articulate and show how some of the greatest minds of history were and are believers in God or some transcendent power. And we looked at Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, and Max Planck in order to show that very sophisticated scientists affirmed a creator. And then I was mentioning before the break how there are Catholic clergymen in particular that modern scientists stand upon the shoulders of. So, for example, the writings of Roger Bacon, 13th century English Franciscan monk, predicted the construction of the telescope and laid the groundwork for the scientific method. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk and priest who was the founder of genetics. And perhaps the most famous is Father Georges Lemaitre, who was a 20th century director in the 20th century, the director of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and was one of the two originators of the Big Bang Theory. He did it independently of a Russian physicist who came up with the same theory, but was later empirically verified with the Hubble telescope a few years after that, when he came up with the theory in 1927. And so this is just to illustrate how there were very smart people within the scientific community who were particularly Catholic clergymen, and it's upon the shoulders of these men that modern scientists stand upon. So if we're going to follow the principle that, hey, if smart people in favor theism and religious beliefs, then I'm going to follow them. If you're going to operate on that principle, then you should be adopting theism and religion, generally speaking, and embracing religious beliefs. And so these are some ways in which we can respond to that first reason why people reject religion. I reject religion because most smart people reject religion. Okay, now let's move to the second reason why people often reject religion, and that is religion is mere wish fulfillment to quell our fears. You find this sort of claim among many atheists, and it comes from 19th century psychoanalyst, right, Sigmund Freud. In his book, The Future of an Illusion, he wrote the following: religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. There's the wish fulfillment idea. As we already know, the terrifying impression of helplessness in childhood aroused the need for protection through love, which was provided by the Father, and the recognition that this helplessness lasts throughout life made it necessary to cling to the existence of a Father, but this time a more powerful one. Thus, the benevolent rule of divine providence allays or quells our fears of the dangers of life. And so there you have Sigmund Freud proposing this idea that religion is nothing but mere wish fulfillment to quell our fears. And for many, this is a reason why they reject religion, because they buy in to this line of reasoning. So the objection would go something like, Freud's right here, in that God is nothing but an invention of our imagination that we conjure up because of our desire for protection from the dangers of life. Belief in God, therefore, so it's argued, is seen as nothing but a coping mechanism for humans. So that's how the objection is presented. What are some ways in which we can respond? I got 5 answers that I'm going to share with you here. First of all, this is mere assertion without argumentation. Freud doesn't offer evidence for his claim. He simply asserts it. And even former atheist and emeritus professor of psychology at New York University, Paul Vitz, recognizes this. He writes this in his book, Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. Nowhere did Freud publish a psychoanalysis of the belief in God based on clinical evidence provided by a believing patient. Freud's general projection theory is an interpretation of religion that stands on its own, unsupported by psychoanalytic theory of clinical evidence. So Vitz here, the atheist Vitz, recognizes Freud's mere assertion without evidence. Since Freud's theory is an assertion without evidence, well, then one response is simply to negate the assertion and just simply say, well, belief in God is not a construct of the imagination. Sometimes the only response to an assertion, the only response that an assertion requires is another assertion. And this would be case in point. If any atheist who adopts Freud's position here is not interested in giving evidence for his belief, well, then he can't demand that we give evidence for ours. But we don't have to be content. We don't have to content ourselves with just contradicting Freud's objection. We can go further in a few different ways to show that Freud's objection here has no persuasive force and thus is not a reason to reject religion. So here's our second response. The objection makes 2 problematic assumptions, the first of which is that it assumes there are no rational grounds for belief in God. And so it's simply begging the question against the traditional theists. Consider that Freud assumes there's no rational grounding for belief in God. The need for a psychological explanation for belief in God would arise if and only if there were no rational grounds to believe. So if you ain't got rational grounds to believe, well, then you try to provide some psychological explanation. But theists throughout the centuries have provided a number of philosophical arguments to establish rational grounds for belief in God. So, for example, you got the fine-tuning argument, maybe, or the Kalam cosmological argument. That offers probable knowledge that God exists, or you got certain knowledge that God exists, coming from, say, Aquinas' 5 ways. These arguments, both probabilistic arguments and exact knowledge arguments, have persuaded many great minds to give up their atheism and adopt theism. Now, perhaps there are some believers who would fall under Freud's explanation, where they just simply believe because they got to have some comfort feeling of being protected. But that doesn't mean that all belief in God is an ungrounded construct of the imagination. So that's the first problematic assumption that Freud's objection makes. It assumes there are no rational grounds for belief in God, which is simply begging the question against the theists. Now, the second problematic assumption is that it assumes that we should reject what brings us comfort. There's a hidden assumption there, right? He's making the argument, well, the idea of a protecting father, i.e. God, brings us comfort, and that's why we should reject religion. Well, the implied principle is we should reject that which brings us comfort, but that's not necessarily true. Why should comfort be a reason to reject religion? How ridiculous would it be to reject every idea that brings us comfort? Because it brings us comfort, right? Atheists don't do that. No one does. Just because something brings us comfort is not a reason why we should reject it. The real question is that which brings us comfort true? So the idea that God exists and that he's a providential God, protecting us and guiding us and leading us, that brings us comfort. True, that is true. But the question is that idea and that concept of God true? Does it map on with reality? That's the real question at hand. But this objection that Freud makes here totally sidesteps that real question at hand. Now, here's a third response. The objection actually cuts both ways. Perhaps it's true. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it's true that fear of death, a desire for justice, and a desire to see our lives as having meaning and purpose could lead us to believe in a God that made us for eternal life and will reward and punish us based on our deeds. But isn't it also true that a desire to be free from moral constraints and the oversight of a transcendent God could lead us to think that there is no God and that we're just clever animals that devise purpose and meaning for our own lives? Perhaps people reject God because they don't take comfort in the idea of a cosmic judge punishing them for acting against an objective moral law. If the fear of death could explain belief in God, well, then the fear of punishment could explain the choice to not believe in God. And so this objection actually is a two-edged sword. It cuts both ways. If the logic is going to be applied to us as theists, well, then the logic could just as easily be applied to atheists. Now, as theists, we're not going to say, well, we should reject atheism because some people fear a cosmic judge and a moral lawgiver. That would be fallacious reasoning. But what we're pointing out here is that we can turn the tables and say, hey, look, Mr. Atheist, if you're going to use that logic to show why you are going to reject religion, well, then we could use that same logic to show you why you should reject your atheism. So again, we can turn the tables and the argument cuts both ways. Now, a fourth response to this objection is that traditional monotheistic religions consider divine punishment or eternal damnation in hell to be an essential element of their belief system. Well, this kind of fact doesn't fit with Freud's psychological explanation. If believers were conjuring up the idea of God in order to bring them comfort, why would they also conjure up the idea that they possibly could be eternally punished? Such an idea doesn't seem to bring much comfort. So that essential component of traditional religious beliefs in a variety of different religious systems doesn't match up with this idea of it being mere wish fulfillment and a construct of our imagination. And we offered four of the five responses to that objection. And I'd like to pick back up with our fifth answer to the objection. And that is, as shown in arguments for God's existence, we can say that Freud, and at least the atheists who follow him, they actually get it backwards. The desire for God is not evidence against God and reason to reject religion. Rather, the desire for God is evidence for God's existence. Several philosophers have constructed philosophical arguments from the desire for happiness or the good, and it leads us and follow that evidence in order to explain that desire, arrive at the conclusion that an infinite good, namely God, exists. So here's a sketch of the line of reasoning. By nature, we have a craving for infinite goodness. And this craving is manifest when we don't experience perfect happiness we thought we'd get from goods in this life, like money, fame, and power. Our dissatisfaction with the limitations of these goods reveals that we actually desire a good that won't leave us wanting. That's not limited. That's infinite goodness. Now, the reasoning goes, if nature does nothing in vain, well, then it follows that there must exist a corresponding satisfaction for that desire, namely God. And therefore, rather than our desire for an all-good God explaining why we think God exists, it's actually the infinite good or God that explains why we desire God. He's the one who plants the desire for the infinite good within our hearts in order to draw us to himself, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church explains in paragraph 27. So Freud may have missed the mark on the wish part of his wish fulfillment theory, but he actually hit the bullseye on the fulfillment part, because God is not just some wish our wounded hearts make up, but he certainly does fulfill all our deepest, most natural desires, because he is the infinite good that we naturally desire. We desire that good beyond which no more good can be desired. So as St. Augustine says in reference to God, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So these are some ways in which we can respond to that objection that religion is mere wish fulfillment, and thereby something that we ought to reject. So now we come to the third reason why people reject religion that we're going to look at in today's episode, and that is religion because thinking is hard. Some people think religion is just a cop-out for having to think about things yourself, and so it's a betrayal of the human intellect, so it's argued. Now, I'm going to give 4 answers here in response, and hopefully we can get through all 4 of them before the end of today's episode. And here's the first. Most new atheists actually define atheism in a way that doesn't require thinking. So it would seem as if, at least for these atheists, they would run afoul of this idea that thinking is hard, right? So consider, for example, the American Atheist website, how it defines atheism as not an affirmative belief that there is no God, but a lack of belief in gods. With this view, no thinking whatsoever is necessary as to whether we should embrace atheism. As one online apologist puts it, if atheism were merely a lack of belief, well, then a person with a severe mental handicap or even brain death would qualify as an atheist, or the brainless scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz would be an atheist. But that seems to stretch the meaning of what atheism is and what an atheist is. To say that atheism is a lack of belief, which avoids shouldering the burden of proof for their position, seems to be just another way of saying, I don't want to think about it. So rather than the mantra being religion because thinking is hard, on this view of atheism, it would be atheism because thinking is hard. It just simply seems to sidestep the need for shouldering a burden of proof for one's position that there is no God. Now, a second response is that this objection manifests gross ignorance of the philosophy of God tradition. To say that people embrace religious beliefs and affirm that God exists because they don't want to think about it, again, it's just a gross ignorance of the intellectual tradition within Catholicism of great minds who have spent a lot of time and have given serious thought and providing lots of philosophical arguments for God's existence. So it's just simply factually false. People have embraced religious beliefs and affirmed that God exists because of the hard thinking that they went through. And so for someone to just come along and claim, well, people embrace religion because thinking is hard, again, it's just a manifestation of gross ignorance of the philosophy of God tradition. Now, a third response is that what seems to be really going on with this slogan or catchphrase is the idea that belief itself is irrational. So consider, for example, Richard Dawkins, as he stated in a 2013 Cambridge Union Society debate with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. He claimed that religion is a betrayal of the intellect. And so what seems to be going on here is that because religion entails belief and believing something based on the testimony of another, well, then you're somehow betraying the intellect, as if belief itself were irrational. But most atheists, they have general faith and general belief, right? They believe things based on the testimonies of others. Possibly they've driven over a bridge without verifying for themselves its safety, deducing that by its mere presence it's safe, right? And believing the construction company who built the bridge. Perhaps they sought the testimony of the architects and construction workers who designed and built the bridge, getting confirmation that the bridge would support cars driving across it, right? They may have even driven across the bridge to the grocery store in order to buy a can of mixed nuts. And I doubt they put the can in their basket, that upon putting the can in their basket, they stopped and said, oh, wait a minute. Can I believe the testimony of the company that put the label on the can? Are these nuts actually mixed? Have I betrayed my intellect? I doubt that they have done such things. Moreover, I'm sure atheists dig science and they believe in science, right? And accept much of what science tells us about the world, but I'd be willing to bet they haven't verified for themselves most of what they accept as scientific truth. Not even scientists can verify every scientific theory past or present. They would never be able to make any progress if they had to do so. So belief is not just a part of religion. It belongs to our everyday experience as human beings, providing us grounds to engage in all sorts of human activities. Belief or faith within religions that claim to have special revelation from God is simply a special case of believing. The act of religious belief that accepts something as true is based ultimately on the testimony of the God of revelation and the testimony of the person who conveys that revelation. So if someone's going to be inclined to reject religion because it entails belief, well, then they're going to have to reject all sorts of things of everyday experience because everyday experience entails belief. So belief itself is not irrational, assuming that the belief is based upon testimony that is indeed credible. And so this leads us to answer number 4 in response to this objection. And that is, religious belief does require thinking through the claimants to special revelation. We need to weigh the credibility of the testimony, and that's where the rubber hits the road in our quest to know, love, and serve the infinite God of revelation, whose existence has also been deduced via philosophical reasoning. We have to apply the tools of reason to see if it's reasonable to believe, for example, Jesus, Muhammad, or Joseph Smith. If the testimony of an alleged revelation is not credible, well, then we shouldn't believe it. But the reason for such a rejection wouldn't be because belief itself is irrational. It would be because the belief in a particular alleged revelation is unwarranted. And so I don't know about you, my friends, but such an approach to religion doesn't seem to me to be a cop-out. Careful thinking is required when investigating which is the true religion. And even the beliefs that make up the religion require careful thinking to articulate and understand, at least the beliefs of a religion worthy of being the true religion. And this is definitely true of Christianity, as the Christian tradition has shown. So yes, thinking is hard, but there's no reason to assume that such a human endeavor can't lead one to religion, especially the Christian religion. So at least for us as Christians, we are all about thinking through these things, because we believe the Creator, God, has created us with an intellect to use. He gave us the tool to think through these things, and so He intends for us to use that very tool of the intellect to think through these things and provide rational grounds for our belief. Well, my friends, that does it for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. We looked at 3 reasons why some people reject religion. Number 1, most smart people are atheists. Religion is wish fulfillment to quell fears. And religion is embraced only because thinking is hard. Our Catholic claim here is that these are not good reasons to reject religion. And I think we made good on this claim in today's episode. So my friends, thanks for listening to The Catholic Reason. Again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. You can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at carlobroussard.com under the audio tab. You'll see The Catholic Reason there. Also, if you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the air in a future episode, and we have some coming in, I'm beginning to prepare those, you can do so by emailing me at Carlo, Karlo, at stmichaelradio.com. That's Saint, S-T, stmichaelradio.com. And so, my friends, also be sure to check out all my other work that I have, my videos, my audio products, my podcasts, which I also do for Catholic Answers, the Sunday Catholic Word. And all of that is found at carlobroussard.com. I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason as we continue looking at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless you.